Chapter 3, Part 2 of 30 Years a Slave, From Bondage to Freedom, The Institution of Slavery as Seen on the Plantation and in the Home of the Planter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. 30 Years a Slave, From Bondage to Freedom, The Institution of Slavery as Seen on the Plantation and in the Home of the Planter, by Lewis Hughes. Chapter 3, Part 2 Rebels Burned Their Cotton. The capture of Memphis by the Union troops closed the principal cotton market of the country, and there was, as a consequence, an immense accumulation of the product in the hands of the farmers of that region. They were, therefore, compelled to resort to temporary expedients for its protection from the elements. Old Master Jack had his piled up in a long rick, and shelters built over it. Other farmers did the same. As cotton was almost the only source of revenue for the farmers, and as there was now no opportunity of getting it to market, there was such a dearth of money as had seldom, if ever, been known, and a corresponding dearth of those necessaries of life which money was the only means of procuring. The accumulations of our family in this product were very great. While the rebel farmers were waiting for a time when they could turn their stores of this valuable article into money, proclamation was issued by the rebel government that all the owners of cotton that had it stored on their farms must prepare to have it burned. Hundreds of rebel soldiers marched to every section of Mississippi that they could reach, and applied the torch to these cotton ricks. The destruction was enormous. This was to prevent the cotton from falling into the hands of the Unionists. Jeff Davis said to his deluded followers that it was better for them to destroy this property than to risk its coming into the possession of their enemies, since that would equally impoverish themselves, while it might result to the pecuniary advantage of those with whom they were at war. I know that it was a terrible sight when our cotton was burned. Hundreds of bales were consumed, and it seemed like a wholly unnecessary destruction of property, and therefore unwise as a war measure. Many were sorry that they had acquiesced in the policy, as it cost them thousands of dollars, and made many poor. They thought that possibly their farms might have escaped the visits of the Union soldiers, and the property, so much needed, been saved in whole or in part. They reasoned, and reasoned correctly, that their condition would in no sense have been worse if their cotton had not been burned by their own soldiers, but might have been much better in many cases, without any real detriment to the rebel cause. The sacrifice of the property of their own people by the rebel authorities was evidence of the desperation of the condition of the rebellion, and was so regarded by not a few at that time. Those were terrible days. One could see anxiety written on every face among the whites. The slaves even looked worried at times, though the war meant so much to them, as they were always looking forward to freedom at its close, if the Union troops were successful. My fourth runaway trip. After I had been working on the farm about 2 months, and had thoroughly talked the matter over with Alfred Dandridge, we planned to make a careful and persistent effort to escape from the land of bondage. We thought that as others, here and there all through the neighborhood, were going, we would make trial of it. My wife and I were at old Master Jack's, and, after we had consulted with Alfred and Lydia, his wife, we all concluded to go at once. Alfred had been a teamster for Dandridge for many years, and was familiar with the road, as he had hauled cotton into Memphis for his master for so long a time he could hardly tell when he began. Matt Dandridge was a fellow servant belonging to the same man, and both had, as was not unusual, taken their master's name, or rather were known by it. Matt had learned of our purpose to run away, and concluded to join our party. So one night, when all was still, we started. Uncle Alfred, as I always called him, was to be our leader. He was older than any of the rest of us, and had had a good deal of experience. We, therefore, all looked to him; in fact, we relied entirely upon him. After we had traveled about 12 miles, we came to a swamp, called Hickey Halley. Here we stopped, as day was dawning, and settled down for the day, as we could travel only in the night, lest we should be seen and caught. We were wet, our clothes soaked through from the heavy dew. We had to travel through cornfields, cotton patches, oat fields and underbrush, not daring to take the main road. This is why we were so wet. Uncle Alfred traveled wholly by the stars. They were his guide. He knew by looking at them the 4 cardinal points of the compass. Many old slaves were guided in this way when traveling in the night, and some could tell the time of night by the position of the stars. We stayed in Hickey Halley all day, and in the evening, when it was dark enough, we started on again, Uncle Alfred offering up a prayer to God to guide us safely through. Coldwater was our next stopping place, and here a difficulty rose before us that made us fearful. We had nothing to wear but what we had on, and not much of that, so had small space for carrying anything, and therefore had brought with us only a little bite to eat. As we had lived on this small provision for a day, there was now but little left for our increasing wants, and the difficulty of securing anything from the houses without danger of detection was almost insurmountable. But we felt encouraged as we thought of what we were striving for, and sped on our way. But the way was hard, for sometimes we got completely stuck in briar patches, and had to turn and go back, in order to find a way out. Old logs and driftwood that had been piled up year after year were other obstacles in our way, and one can imagine how hard it was to make our way through such a mass of brush and forest by the dim light of the stars as they struggled through the dense branches of the trees. We stumbled on, however, as best we could, each fearful, yet silently praying for guidance and help. When within 4 or 5 miles of Coldwater, Uncle Alfred stopped, cautioned us not to speak above a whisper, as the rebel troops were camped on both sides of us. We were in a swamp between the 2 roads, gradually working our way through to the river, as we could not go on either side of the roads for fear of detection. At the bridges, where these roads crossed the river, there were rebel camps, and it was useless for us to think of crossing either. We therefore worked our way carefully through the thicket that we were in until we came within sight of the river. Then Uncle Alfred went ahead, creeping a few steps, then stopping to see if the river was clear of soldiers. From this point it was some 2½ miles to the bridges each way, and it was our idea that if we could cross here without being seen by the soldiers, we would be all right. Uncle Alfred came back to us and told us that he thought the way was clear. "I cannot hear a sound," said he, "so let us go on." We followed the river down until we came to a place where we could cross. Here we found some driftwood. An old tree had been blown down, nearly across the river, leaving a space of about 20 feet. Over this natural bridge we crept to the open space which we waded, the water being up to our knees. But we did not mind this. There was no talking above a whisper, for fear of being heard by the soldiers. Daylight had begun to dawn, and we felt good that we had succeeded thus far. We went on quietly until we got entirely out of the swamp and reached some hills. The woods were on each side of us and still thick, so we stopped here on the side of a hill where the sun shone brightly on us, expecting to rest for the day. Our clothes had already become quite dry from the sunshine, and, so far, we felt all right. Alfred and I had made a turn around the place, listening to see if we could hear any noise, or see any trace of soldiers. But we discovered no trace of them, and went back to our stopping place. I had been asleep, and some of the others were still asleep, when suddenly I heard the yelp of bloodhounds in the distance. It seemed quite far away at first, but the sound came nearer and nearer, and then we heard men yelling. We knew now that they were on our trail, and became so frightened that we all leaped to our feet and were about to run when Uncle Alfred said, "Stop, children, let me oil your feet." He had with him a bottle of ointment made of turpentine and onions, a preparation used to throw hounds off a trail. All stopped, and the women, having their feet anointed first, started off, Uncle Alfred telling them to run in different directions. He and I were the last to start. Alfred said, "Don't let the bushes touch you." At the same time he ran through the bushes with such a rattling noise one could have heard him a great distance. He wore one of those old-fashioned oilcloth coats made in Virginia, and, as he ran, the bushes, striking against the coat, made a noise like the beating of a tin board with sticks. The funny part of it was that, having cautioned us to be careful about noise, he made more than all of us. By this time the woods were resounding with the yelping of the hounds and the cries of their masters. The hounds numbered some 14. The men howled and cheered in concert with the brutes, for they knew that they were on the right trail, and it would be but a short time before they caught us all. I had gotten further away than any of them. Having run about a mile, I came to a farm, and started across an open field, hoping to reach a wood beyond, where I might conceal myself. Before I was halfway across the field, on looking back, I saw the dogs coming over the fence, and knowing there was no chance of my getting to the woods, I turned around and ran back to a persimmon tree, and just had time to run up one of the branches when the dogs came upon the ground. I looked and saw the men, Williams the nigger catcher, and Dr. Henry and Charles Dandridge. As soon as Williams rode up, he told me to come down, but I was so frightened I began to cry, yet came down trembling. The dogs laid hold of me at once, tearing my clothes and biting my flesh. Dr. Dandridge was just riding up, and seeing what was happening, yelled out to Williams, "I thought your dogs didn't bite." "Oh, well," said Williams, "he ain't hurt. We've got to let him bite a little." They took us all back to the fence where I crossed over, all the others having been caught. Our hearts were filled with dismay. All looked as if they were condemned to be hung. We knew not what was to be done with us. The women were pitiful to see, crying and moaning, all courage utterly gone. They started back with us to old Master Jack's at Panola, and we stopped for the night at a small farmhouse. The old woman who kept it said, tauntingly, "You niggers going to the Yankees? You all ought to be killed." We started on the following morning and got back home at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. All of us were whipped. All the members of the family were very angry. Old lady Jack McGee was so enraged that she said to my wife, "I thought you were a Christian. You'll never see your God." She seemed to think that because Matilda had sought freedom, she had committed a great sin. Incidents. Ever since the beginning of the war, and the slaves had heard that possibly they might sometime be free, they seemed unspeakably happy. They were afraid to let the masters know that they ever thought of such a thing, and they never dreamed of speaking about it except among themselves. They were a happy race, poor souls, notwithstanding their downtrodden condition. They would laugh and chat about freedom in their cabins, and many a little rhyme about it originated among them, and was softly sung over their work. I remember a song that Aunt Kitty, the cook at Master Jack's, used to sing. It ran something like this: "There'll be no more talk about Monday by and by, but every day will be Sunday by and by." The old woman was singing, or rather humming it, one day, and old lady McGee heard her. She was busy getting her dinner, and I suppose never realized she was singing such an incendiary piece, when old Mrs. McGee broke in upon her. Don't think you're going to be free. You darkies were made by God and ordained to wait upon us." Those passages of Scripture which refer to master and servants were always cited to us when we heard the Word preached, and they were interpreted as meaning that the relation of master and slave was right and proper, that they were rightly the masters and we the slaves. I remember not long after Jeff Davis had been elected President of the Confederacy that I happened to hear old Master Jack talking to some of the members of the family about the war, etc. All at once the old man broke out, "And what do you think? That rascal Abraham Lincoln has called for 300,000 more men. What is Jeff Davis doing?" He talked on, and seemed so angry that he gave no one a chance to answer. "Jeff Davis is a grand rascal," said he. "He ought to go into the field himself." At first all the Southerners were jubilant over Davis, but as they were losing so, and the Unionists gaining, they grew angry and denounced him oftentimes in unsparing terms. Union Raid at Master's Farm. During the time the Union headquarters were at Helena, a Union gunboat came down the river as far as Bolivar, and stopped at Miles McGee's. The soldiers made a raid through the farm, taking chickens, turkeys, meat, and everything that they could lay hands on. During this raid Miles McGee came out of the house with a gun, and shot the commanding officer of the party. He became alarmed over what he had done, and hid in the cabin of one of the servants. He never came near the house. The Union soldiers came 3 different times to catch him, but never succeeded. The last time they came, he made for the canebrake, and hid himself there until they were gone. But though he had escaped their righteous vengeance, he became so nervous that he left his hiding place in the canebrake, and went to Atlanta, Georgia, and stayed there among friends until things became more quiet. At last, wearying of this, he determined to return to old Master Jack's, but not to his own home. Word had been received of his coming, and great preparations were made for his reception. After he had started on his return, he was taken ill on the train, and was left at a small town called Jackson, where he soon died. I drove the family to the depot upon the day of his expected arrival, and as the train came in, the women waved their handkerchiefs, and, when the conductor stepped off, they asked him if Mr. McGee was aboard. He said no. I have his remains. The scene that followed I cannot describe. Such wailing and screaming, I could not but feel sad, even though they had treated me so meanly, causing the death of my children, and separating me from my wife. Their grief was indeed great. The sad news was conveyed to his mother, old Mrs. Jack McGee, at the house by an advance messenger, and we soon followed with the body. He was the favorite son of his mother, and her grief was very great. But for his wanton shooting of the Union officer, he would probably not have met his death as he did. Union soldiers pass the Panola home. One winter night, while I was at old Master Jack's, I was awakened by a rumbling noise like that of heavy wagons, which continued steadily, and so long a time that I finally concluded it must be an army passing. And such I found to be the case, upon getting up and venturing out, the rumbling which had awakened me being caused by the passing artillery. I was afraid to go out straight to the soldiers, but would take a few steps at a time, then stop and listen behind a tree or the shrubbery. All seemed quiet, there was no talking. I had listened about 20 minutes when there seemed to be a halt at the creek, some distance from the house. Soon afterwards I heard the command given, "Forward!" I at once made up my mind that they were Yankee soldiers. I got on my knees and crawled to the fence, not daring to go openly, fearing that they might hear or see me and shoot, supposing me to be a spy. I went back into the house and told my wife that they were Yankees who had just passed. "Uncle George," said I, "this would be a good time for us to go." "Oh, no," said he, "we are not quite ready." Uncle George's cabin was where my wife and I stayed while at old Master Jack's. In the morning I was to carry a parcel to Como, a place not far from home, to Mr. James McGee, who was in the rebel army. It was not quite daylight when I made ready to go on my trip, for I was anxious to find out more about the soldiers. Going to the stable and saddling my horse, I mounted and rode out to the big gate leading to the main road, just as day was dawning. As I dismounted to open the gate, some soldiers were passing, and an officer sung out to me, "Hello, which way are you going?" I said, "To Como, to carry this parcel of clothing to my young master in the war." "You have a fine horse," said the officer. "I guess I will exchange horses with you." He took my package of clothing and some letters which I had to mail and my horse, leaving me his, which was a very poor animal. I was badly scared at this performance, fearing that I would be severely whipped for the loss of the horse and package. Yet, how could I help it? We knew nothing but to serve a white man, no matter what he asked or commanded. As a matter of course, I did not go to Como, as I had nothing to take the officer had everything but went back to the cabin. I suppose that the soldiers had all passed, but in about half an hour Aunt Kitty, on looking out of her cabin window, exclaimed, "My God, just look at the soldiers!" The yard was covered with the blue coats. Another venerable slave said, "My Lord, the year of Jubilee am come." During the excitement I ran to the big house and told the madam that the Yankees were there, and had taken my horse and everything I had. Old Master Jack had heard the news, but was not able to come out. He had arisen, but when he knew of the presence of the Yankees he went back to bed, calling for Kitty to get him a mush poultice. "Tell Kitty itty to get me a mush poultice oltis." It was customary, after the beginning of the war, for him to take sick and call for a poultice to be put upon his stomach whenever he heard of the Yankees being near. He and many like him were especially valorous only when the bluecoats were far away. The soldiers went into the dairy and drank all the milk, helped themselves to butter, cheese, meat, bread and everything in sight which they wanted. Nothing was said to them by the white folks, but the slaves were glad, and whispered to each other, "Ah, we's going to be free." Old Master Jack, lying on his couch, would ask every little while, "Where are they? Are they gone?" After they had all left the premises, he said, "My God, I can't stand it. Them devils are just going through the country destroying everything." I was sent down to get Uncle Peter for old Master, and when Peter came up, the old man asked, "Well, did any of the servants go away?" And, sir, them devils took Lewis's horse and the clothes he had for his young master. Hiding valuables from the Yankees. Right after this, the McGees commenced planning to put away their valuables to keep them from the Union soldiers. All the servants had to fill up their bed ticks with fine gin cotton, the lint part for safe keeping. Great boxes and barrels were packed full of their best things and put into the cellar under the house. It was not exactly a cellar, but a large shallow excavation which held a great deal. We put all the solid silverware, such as cake baskets, trays, spoons, forks, dishes, etc., in boxes, and buried them under the hen house. Great packages of the finest clothing I had to make up, and these were given in charge of certain servants whose duty it was to run into the big house and get them, whenever they heard that the Yankees were coming, and take them to their cabins. This was a shrewd arrangement, for the soldiers never went into the cabins to get anything. When the soldiers had passed, these packages were taken back to the house. It speaks well for the honesty and faithfulness of the slaves that such trusts could be devolved upon them, notwithstanding all the cruelties inflicted upon them by their masters. Death to runaway slaves. It was about this time that the law or regulation of the rebel government was promulgated authorizing or directing the shooting or hanging of any slave caught trying to get away to the Union Army. This barbarous law was carried out in many cases, for every little while we would hear of some slave who was caught running away and hung or shot. A slave belonging to Boss ran away and got safely within the Union lines, but he returned to get his sister. They both got away from the house, but had gone only a few miles when William McGee overtook them and shot the man dead. William boasted of this, but told Uncle Peter, the foreman, that he never wanted it mentioned. Slaves hung and left to rot as a warning. 2 slaves belonging to one Wallace, one of our nearest neighbors, had tried to escape to the Union soldiers, but were caught, brought back, and hung. All of our servants were called up, told every detail of the runaway and capture of the poor creatures and their shocking murder, and then compelled to go and see them where they hung. I never shall forget the horror of the scene. It was sickening. The bodies hung at the roadside where the execution took place, until the blue flies literally swarmed around them, and the stench was fearful. This barbarous spectacle was for the purpose of showing the passing slaves what would be the fate of those caught in the attempt to escape, and to secure the circulation of the details of the awful affair among them throughout all the neighborhood. It is difficult at this day for those not familiar with the atrocities of the institution of slavery to believe that such scenes could ever have been witnessed in this or any other civilized land, as a result simply of a human being's effort to reach a portion of the country where the freedom of which it was said to be the home could be enjoyed without molestation. Yet such was the horrible truth in not one case alone, but in many, as I know only too well. Runaway slave caught and whipped. One day, while I was waiting at dinner, some of the children from the slave quarters came running into the house, and said to old Master Jack, "Uncle John is going away. He is down to the creek." He had been put in the carpenter's shop, fastened in the stocks, but by some means he had gotten the stocks off his feet and got loose. All in the house immediately got up and ran out. Old Master told me to run and catch the runaway. I did not like to do it, but had to obey. Old Master and I ran in pursuit, and soon overtook him. He could not run, as the stocks were still on his arms and neck. We brought him back, and he was staked out. That is, 4 stakes were driven into the ground, the arms tied to 2 and the legs to the other 2. He was then paddled with the whipping paddle upon the bottom of his feet by old Master Jack until blood blisters arose, when he took his knife and opened them. I was then sent for salt and water, and the bruises of the suffering chattel were washed as usual in the stinging brine. A home guard accidentally shoots himself. After the capture of Memphis by the Union forces, the soldiers were in the habit of making raids into the surrounding country. These were a source of alarm and anxiety among the people, and they were constantly on the watch to defend their property and themselves as best they could. One day Dr. Charles Dandridge went over to one of our neighbors, Mr. Beaubour's, to practice shooting and to see if he had heard anything new about the war. It was the custom of the home guards to meet weekly and practice with their firearms in order to be the better prepared, as they pretended, for any sudden incursion of the now dreaded Yankee. Mr. Beaubour had gotten a Yankee pistol from some friend who was in the army, and Dr. Charles wanted to see and try it. It was shown him, and its workings explained. He took it and began shooting, and in showing the other men how quickly he could shoot a Yankee and mount his horse, he accidentally shot himself under the short rib near his heart, and fell to the ground. All the men came running to him, picked him up, and carried him into the house, immediately sending word to Mrs. Dandridge and Master Jack McGee, his father-in-law. The boys came hurrying in, and told us what had happened. I hitched up and drove Boss over to Mr. Beaubour's. We found the wounded man rapidly sinking, and, when a little later his wife came, He could not speak, only clasped her hand. He died that night, and we carried his body to the home, which so short a time before he had left in health and high spirits. No casket was to be had. Everything of that kind had been consumed or shut out by the war. Accordingly, 2 slaves were ordered to make a coffin, which they did, using plain boards. It was then covered with black alapaca from a dress of the madam, and lined with the cloth from Mrs. Dandridge's opera cloak. The regular material used for these purposes was not to be had. By the time the coffin was ready, the body was so bloated that it could not be got into it. Resort was then had to a plain box, and in this the body of another of the stricken family group was laid away. At the suggestion of old Master Jack, the coffin was put up in the carriage house, for safe keeping, he saying it would do for him to be buried in. Sorrow had come to this family with such crushing force that their former pride and boastful spirit had given place to utter dejection. Substitutes for coffee. During the war, everything was scarce and dear, and substitutes were devised for many of those things which had formerly been regarded as the necessaries of life. Sweet potatoes were peeled, then cut in small pieces, and put out in the sun to dry. They were then used as a substitute for coffee when that article became so scarce toward the close of the war. Great quantities of this preparation were used. Okra was another substitute for coffee. It was dried in the pod, then the seeds shelled out, and these were dried again and prepared something as the coffee is. This made a delicious drink when served with cream, being very rich and pleasant to the taste. Quinine was a medicine that had been of almost universal use in the South. Yet it became so scarce that it was sold at $7 a bottle and could not often be had at that price. Lemon leaves were used as a substitute in cases of chills and fever. The leaves were made into a tea and given to the patient hot, to produce perspiration. During an attack of chills, I was treated in this manner to some advantage. At any rate, I got well, which can not always be said of all methods of treatment. End of Chapter 3, Part 2. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.